Good morning, everybody. Just as always, starting off by watching the numbers as everybody's joining the Grand Rounds this morning. Thank you for being here. Hope you're all having a great month, a great summer, and we have another exciting medical Grand Rounds presenter today, as well as introducer of our presenter. And we don't really have too many updates today. The main update really is just mentioning next week's Grand Rounds. So our presenters are Doctors Ron Lee and Jonathan Chen from my own Department of Hospital Medicine. The exact title is still pending, but I had asked them to come and speak about the future of AI in medicine. Both of them are very involved of the large language model, like ChatGPT and whatnot. And we've been working with them a lot to integrate that in medicine. But I wanted to talk to them about where we are now and really the future of just AI in general in medicine. So this is the first of what will be many Grand Rounds talking about this topic in the future, you can imagine. And so we're looking forward for them to kick us off on this topic. So that'll be next week. It'll be Zoom only. So please do join us next week. And really, we don't have any other major updates today. As always, if there are updates that you'd like us to have, please do let me know. I'd love any input on things that we can be sharing news on at the start of these Grand Rounds. That being said, I'm going to now turn over to Dr. Parsonet, who will be introducing Dr. Winslow today. So Dr. Parsonet, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Errol. And good morning, everybody. So introducing our speaker today brought to mind a time in my life when I was actually introduced by a family member. So some years ago, my Rye and acerbic brother, Jeff Parsonet, who's an ID doctor at Dartmouth, introduced me at their Grand Rounds. And he said, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Julie Parsonet, no relation. So today, I get to introduce my husband, who I'm happy to say is a relation. And most of you know Dean as this great hospitalist with encyclopedic knowledge of medicine and a knack for doing medical procedures and a gift for the human interactions of medicine. And for that, he's been elected to be a master of the American College of Physicians, to the Royal Academy of Medicine, and he's also won the Rambar Mark Award and lots of other honors at Stanford and several teaching awards. But I just wanted to say that Dean has gotten a lot of other things done in his life, and I wanted to just highlight a few. He was a leader in the field of HIV when HIV was first discovered. He developed the first HIV protease when he was working at DuPont. And he also started the first HIV clinic in Delaware and was a leader in pushing for excellent patient care throughout the United States in the early days of AIDS. He served as a flight surgeon in the US Air Force for 35 years and in the Air National Guard, and rose to the rank of colonel. He had 6 combat tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan and had over 250 combat missions, as well as serving in many relief missions around the world. He was lead physician in Antarctica, as we talked about once before at Grand Rounds. He led the National Guard public health response in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. He's created and led 2 charitable foundations, one to help refugees and immigrants in the United States, and the other one to stem gun violence. And done many, who was the chair of medicine at Santa Clara Valley, many other things. And there are 2 things that I want to just mention that he's most proud of, which is he has a type rating in many aircraft, including the Boeing 737, and once considered flying, actually not too long ago, flying for Southwest, and garnered the prestigious Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award for 50 years of safe flight, which is a huge honor. And he also ran a 406 mile as a walk-on at Penn State. So to sum it up, he's an amazing guy who is always in the arena. And most recently, he stepped into the arena again, taking a leave of absence from Stanford during the worst days of COVID to run the White House Testing and Diagnostic Task Force. And that's going to be the major brunt of his talk today. So I'm very proud to introduce Dean Winslow, who is a relation. So here you go, Dean.
Thanks, Julie. It's a lovely introduction. Really appreciate it. I'll just do the share screen here. Okay, great. Can you see that, Rochelle and everybody? Okay, super.
Yes, it looked
anyway,
great.
again, thank you, Errol, for inviting me to give this grand rounds. It really is an honor. What I'd like to talk about today was kind of what I did during the almost year and a half that I was on leave of absence from Stanford, from basically March of 21 until July of 22. So anyway, I have no conflict of interest to declare. Again, I'll kind of go through, the purpose of the talk, the agenda today. Again, I think, COVID-19 is hopefully at least well behind us in terms of, the real severe morbidity and mortality. But it really was a kind of a scary time, as all of us remember, who were working, particularly in the hospital back in those early days of the pandemic. Wanted to show this. This is the group that I got to work with when I was at leading the testing and diagnostic working group. I had 82 people, about 30 from CDC, 10 or so from the FDA, about 20 from Department of Defense, as well as other areas of the federal government within HHS, including FEMA. And the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Again, her group, a number of them reported to me as well. It's hard to believe, and I honestly don't even know how many zeros it is, but my budget was $46 billion that year. Again, both to purchase diagnostic tests and other things that were really impacted by the supply chain, as well as to actually develop operational testing programs to roll out diagnostic testing, particularly to vulnerable populations. And I'll go through that in more detail. So again, when I arrived in Washington, D.C. at the end of March of 21, this is my building. This is the Humphrey HHS building, which is kind of catty-cornered across from the U.S. Capitol, sits right on the mall. My son, Sam, who came to visit while I was there a couple of times, I actually pointed out my building, and he's a very sophisticated young man, and he pointed out that this is a classic example of 1970s brutalist architecture. And I had to look it up, but I thought it was a great term describing this type of architecture. And this is the view from my office window that I took during the fall of 21. And so again, when I'd have a kind of a tough day or something, I'd look out the window and say, well, hey, this really is pretty cool that you're able to do this and work with just so many absolutely wonderful people during the year and a half that I was gone. Remember back in March of 21, it really was a tough time. The vaccines had just been rolled out. At this point, really only a small percentage of the US population had the benefit of receiving the vaccine. And if I remember the numbers correctly, by March or April of 21, already almost 1 million Americans had died of COVID-19. And this is a picture I took on the National Mall, showing all the flags, each one representing an American who died from COVID-19. It takes the government a little while to kind of bring people on board. Oh, the other thing I just wanted to mention is it also was kind of a crazy time as well when I arrived in DC, because remember, it was just a few weeks after the January 6th insurrection. And so, again, when I got there, there were still about 4,000 National Guardsmen on active duty in Washington, DC. And again, they were armed with M4 or M16 rifles. And again, we're protecting all of these federal buildings, including mine. So as I mentioned, that CDC actually, said it would take me, at least 2 or 3 months to bring me on board as a federal civil service employee. So the California National Guard actually brought me back on active duty and put me on orders. So, for about the first 2.5 months or so that I was in DC, I was actually back in uniform. So I would, always, of course, in the morning, say hi to the men and women, National Guardsmen, who were at our building or at other buildings close by. This is again a picture that we took back at our quarters back at Bethesda Naval Hospital after one evening. Again, a lot of people, might know too much about the history of the National Guard. I thought I'd talk about that briefly. So the National Guard actually predates the federal U.S. Army. So all of the original 13 colonies, and including later states, had National Guards or still have National Guards. Actually, there's 54 Guard units in the U.S. for each of the 50 states, and then the Washington, D.C., and 3 of our territories. The first Guard unit that I was assigned to from 1980 until 1995 was the Louisiana National Guard, which of course, has a little bit of a checkered history because the Louisiana Guard was part of the Confederacy during the original War of Insurrection. The Washington Artillery was the most famous unit of probably the Louisiana National Guard or militia. I, of course, didn't join until 1980, a few years after the Civil War, but just had a wonderful time, got to learn how to fly as a backseater in the F-4 Phantom. And the picture on the right is my good friend, Jim, call sign Eggplant Cagle, who's an amazing musician. And we would have these wild parties, including sometimes setting pianos on fire, which Eggplant was very capable of playing in a great honky-tonk fashion. The second Guard unit I was assigned to from 1995 until I retired for the first time in 2015 was the Delaware National Guard. And again, the unit emblem indicates that the National Guard in Delaware was founded in 1655, which was a full 120 years before the Minutemen marched Concord and Lexington at the beginning of our own American Revolution. The picture on the right is the Delaware militia in action during the Battle of Long Island during the Revolutionary War. And the picture on the lower left is my buddies and I actually were returning from a combat mission in Afghanistan in 2011, where we had successfully dropped supplies for Marines fighting in Helmand Province. And we actually almost got shot down by anti-aircraft artillery on that mission. So we're pretty happy to be on our way back home to Bagram Airfield when that picture was taken. So anyway, since now I was a member of the California National Guard, I thought I'd learn a little bit about the history. And interestingly, California, which really had just recently become a state when the American Civil War started, contributed more than 15,000 volunteers to the Union Army, including serving with the Massachusetts cavalry, which distinguished itself in a number of battles during the American Civil War. So again, I spent one afternoon when I got off work early and visited Abraham Lincoln's memorial on the Mall. Again, obviously my favorite president and someone I really always look up to. I'm looking forward to if there is something after this life, having a beer or a glass of whiskey with him when we get up to heaven. So anyway, the TDWG's purpose is what, again, the abbreviation for the Testing and Diagnostic Working Group, had a really big charter. And again, it was started in the summer of 2020 during the Trump administration, was largely at that time reported to Brett Giroir, who was the Assistant Secretary for Health. And largely, the Trump administration really empowered Giroir and my predecessor, Michael DiMarco, to really, I think, do some good work. So again, we had the resources to actually understand diagnostic supply chain challenges. And we had the ability to real quickly develop contracts with testing manufacturers to try to build a consistent supply of diagnostic tests, both over-the-counter, point of care, and of course, molecular tests, which were not as constrained by supplies, and also build up stockpiles, not only of actually full tests, but also things like swabs and other reagents that are needed to do COVID-19 testing and testing for other pathogens. We work very closely, as you might imagine, as the CDC always does, with states and territories, and as well as local public health agencies to support surge testing, as well as actually providing supplies, to our partner, health departments. Another thing that CDC really does well is collect and analyze data, which really helps us to determine, again, how to respond most effectively when we were having these outbreaks, particularly in different parts of the country. And then we also had a lot of input into drafting, reviewing, and conveying national federal testing policies. So again, this is kind of just a big overview of, again, some of the responsibilities that our group had during that time. We also engaged very heavily with industry. In fact, had a full-time person who was on loan to us from the FDA, Dr. Steve Santos, who was incredibly effective and met by Zoom call at least once a week with all of the major diagnostic manufacturers, as well as commercial laboratories and companies that were producing the components that we needed to actually develop COVID-19 diagnostic testing. And then we had about every 3 months or so a face-to-face meeting or a hybrid meeting, usually Zoom and face-to-face. Again, as we mentioned, we interacted very closely with federal agencies, state laboratories, public health officers all over the country. And again, we had great data to support, when we could help jump in to support local testing needs, as well as providing technical assistance to the states. And then I think many of you remember that during 2020, that the flow of immigrants across our southwest border really dramatically increased for a whole variety of reasons, largely driven by situations on the ground in Central America. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. So again, our group was tasked with supporting COVID-19 testing for the southwest border. And I later, after the TDWG went away, I served for about 5 months as the chief medical officer, focusing mainly on the unaccompanied children at the southwest border. We also, interacted with a serology team at CDC very closely. So we already talked a lot about this before, but again, procurement of tests and supplies was a big part of what our job was. We also, again, had a number of operational programs, which I'll go into in more detail in just a minute, including the ICAT program, Operation ET, or expanded testing. And then we also supported the CDC ELC program, which also was focused on getting testing out to try to reopen public schools as much as possible. Okay. Again, I mentioned, I think before, that one of the things that I really loved about this job was just having, all of the data collection and analysis support that the CDC brings to the fight. And again, we really relied on usually almost daily outputs of COVID-19 cases and COVID testing data from not just states and territories, but actually down to the county and even the city level in many cases. So again, these are the type of graphs that I would get at least every day or every other day. And again, just to orient you a little bit, that one of the things that the CDC was able to do was to focus on what's called social vulnerability index, which is a combined index that includes income, education level, housing, food insecurity, and other things, to come up with this SVI value. So again, we tried to focus at least our free testing efforts and on areas that had high social vulnerability. So a lot of inner cities, as well as actually several rural areas that met the criteria for high cases and high SVI. So again, in the ICAT program, which stands for Increased Community Access to Testing, and this had actually been started back in February of 21, so just before I joined the group. And so there were actually 4 major efforts under ICAT. The biggest were pharmacy partnerships. So we worked real closely with CVS, Walgreens, and a consortium of pharmacies called eTrue North, mainly in the Midwest. But again, we had these pharmacy in-store testing sites really all over the United States. My total budget, I think, for ICAT was about $12 billion. So again, a good-sized program. We also supported surge site testing, so areas that were having really high numbers of cases. I remember there was a really big outbreak of COVID-19 during the spring and summer of 21 in Clark County in Las Vegas, and there were a number of others, throughout the country. We also supported pop-up testing events. And remember, in 2021, we were already at that point, well, a year past the kind of the start of COVID-19 in the US. And people really wanted to reopen. And again, one of the things that we were approached back in probably April or May of 21 was by NASCAR, and they actually wanted to restart stock car races, NASCAR races. And so they actually asked the CDC and my group for support of testing, as well as working with their local public health departments to offer free vaccination to people attending these NASCAR races. Then also, of course, school reopening was a big priority that was, especially near and dear to me, mainly because my mom was a public school teacher, and also the fact that Julie and I were both very involved with again, the university education, and we actually were living at Stanford in Washington later in that year. And again, students were starting to come back. And of course, people not only at universities, but of course, particularly young children really suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic, both socially as well as from an instructional and educational standpoint. So one of the just kind of funny stories, though, as I mentioned, NASCAR approached us during the late spring of 21 to do testing and vaccination at the first race that they'd had in more than a year and a half. And this was in Talladega, Georgia, which again is shown here. A number of people in my group who actually were based in Atlanta and were sort of temporary duty up in Washington actually volunteered to spend a couple extra days down in the South so they could take in this race. I jokingly told them, though, that I would not sign their expense report for supporting going to this event unless they promised to watch this movie with Will Ferrell, Talladega Nights. And by the way, it's a very funny and kind of a cringy sort of a way of a movie. So they all promised me that they would watch this movie before they sent their expense report to me. So again, ICAT, we work real closely with various testing contractors to provide resources. Again, this was largely pharmacy-based, but also in underserved school districts in more than 20 states that we had in-school ICAT testing set up. And then, we also tried to work with states and counties to transition to more long-term solutions for testing in areas where we were doing the majority of the free testing. I mentioned before that the shutdown of schools really affected students in the United States. And these data actually were not available to me when I was running the TDWG, but this just came out actually a few weeks ago from Stanford, and showing that elementary school students and secondary school students, not just African-American kids or Latino kids, but white kids as well suffered tremendously. In fact, the plots in showing the sort of reduction in test scores really affected all groups that were looked at. So again, this was a big priority of mine, was to roll out testing in schools so the teachers and students both would feel safe returning to in-person school. So we initiated this program in the late spring of 21 called Operation Expanded Testing, which our group, being very kind and very funny people, immediately coined Operation ET, in honor of this guy here, who, if any of you remember seeing that movie, but ET is obviously one of the sweetest beings that probably ever existed. So the way we set up Operation ET was we had three main contractors, Battelle in the Midwest, Eurofins in the Northeast and the South, and PerkinElmer in the West Coast. And so we used mainly PCR-based testing, but rapid turnaround time. So within 24 hours, as a general rule, were guaranteed. And again, we actually had contractors actually in these schools actually doing the swabbing, packaging up the the swabs and getting them sent to these reference laboratories in a very rapid fashion. So this was, again, I think was a real area of success. Unfortunately, particularly in some areas of the South, there was not a huge uptake. Although interestingly, Florida, which of course is not really the biggest bastion of forward thinking, actually had a very large number of Operation ET programs set up and very effective. Again, Northwest, Midwest, and the West Coast, again, very rapid and significant uptake of school testing. So one of the things, though, is that these programs basically were budgeted through essentially only the late fall of 2021. So at that point, the cases were actually falling pretty rapidly in the US. But again, being an infectious disease doctor, we tend not to be optimists about particularly things like pandemics. So my big concern, as were many people in the COVID-19 sphere working at that time, was that we had not seen the end of this pandemic yet. So I wanted to put together a budget to assure particularly purchase of point-of-care tests and over-the-counter tests to focus vulnerable populations as well as underrepresented communities that really needed more resources. So again, just in the interest of time, I won't go through this slide in detail, but it was part of a larger federal package, so to speak, to really be sure that we were doing the right thing for our country and not becoming complacent. So the budget that I put together, we actually called it the Continued Testing Support Program. And again, this was largely to take over after the end of ICAT and Operation ET, which was to go out till June of 22. So we focused on these several sectors. So nursing homes, remember back in 21, even though overall cases in the US were coming down, that there were still huge numbers of outbreaks of often very severe disease or fatal disease in people living in extended care facilities and skilled nursing facilities. As I mentioned before, that we were still seeing large numbers of particularly unaccompanied children coming across the southwest border, often because of the conditions that they had been kept in, as they're basically being smuggled in many cases from Central America through Mexico up across the border, large amounts of COVID-19 in these vulnerable children. And we already talked about that we wanted to put additional resources into school testing, federally qualified health centers. So I think many of you are familiar with this term, or FQHCs. These are, again, our federally supported health centers, community health centers, both in inner cities as well as in surprising number of rural areas that, again, focus on low-income individuals. So, for example, several of Santa Clara Valley Medical Center's clinics are also FQHCs. Another idea that my group and I had was, in order to get over-the-counter tests out to particularly low-income folks, was to distribute them free of charge through food banks. So again, that was also a very successful program. And we also, just because, again, we had a large amount of money that were being allotted by the White House, I also wanted to put some of it actually into viral variant detection, which I was, as a former basic scientist, felt was very important in terms of anticipating potential outbreaks and emergence of new variants. So some of the money that I had, we actually sent back to both CDC and the NIH, to the RADx program, to help with this scientific issue. So as I mentioned before, that when I came on board in March of 21, that cases actually had fallen from the large number of I guess it was Alpha variant that really hit us in December and January. And of course, that was just as some of us lucky ones were being offered the mRNA vaccines for the first time. So again, cases just dramatically spiked. And then came down pretty dramatically in March and April. So that was a little bit of the challenge that I had, since my budget had to be approved by the White House, to persuade the White House that, this virus was not done with America yet. So again, I put together a budget that again requested $3.5 billion, for this continued testing support. So one of the things that why I did want this much money, to help build up our testing supplies was in April of 21, we started seeing reports, including published in MMWR, the CDC's weekly report, that there was this new Delta variant that had just exploded in India. And it went from, less than 7% of sequence cases in March of 21 to, by May of 21, like 90% of cases. So it literally, within a few weeks, kind of just took over. And also the Delta variant was pretty virulent. Large numbers of severe and fatal cases, were being seen in India. So that was one of the arguments that I used to try to persuade the White House that, I really wanted a robust budget to deal with outbreaks here if this Delta variant hit the US. So I did actually ask my modelers at CDC, is this Delta variant something that's going to affect us here in the US? And unanimously, the opinion was that it was going to be. So again, I had additionally a daily conference call with the White House by Zoom. Usually it was 8:30 every morning and lasted about 45 minutes to an hour. These calls were very interesting, but sometimes somewhat contentious, and including this one day in early May of 21, when again I was arguing that we needed this 3.5 billion to support point of care and over-the-counter tests for these vulnerable populations. And anyway, I guess my White House handler was in a bad mood that day, and she basically told me in front of my team, which was a little embarrassing, Dean, I basically argued that this Delta variant that they're seeing in India is going to hit us really hard, and that was why I was requesting the 3.5 billion. Again, as I said, my White House contact was very dismissive and said, kind of a condescending voice, like, Dean, that much money has bad optics. And again, that wasn't really a word that I was familiar with, but I think it's used a lot in politics. So I was pretty upset about it, and I think my team sort of knew, although I didn't really overtly share with them. I guess they could see it on my face. So I went out to lunch early that day. And when I came back, though, that Joe Miller, who ran my ICAT program, and Mary Holscher, who was my main finance person at the TDWG, they had printed out this picture from the 1970 movies MASH, which I think many of you have probably seen. And anyway, and they wrote on it, Dean, we're the pros from Dover, which, there was a takeoff on a line from the movie, but they knew I was from Dover, Delaware. And then they wrote over it, Joe and Mary and Dean as the characters from the movie. So I put it up behind me on my credenza, and so anytime I was having a bad day, I'd look at it and smile and be grateful for the wonderful people that I got to work with every day at the TDWG. So anyway, this was the budget that I ended up getting out of the White House then. So they cut it from 3.5 billion to about 890 million. Again, it was pretty much the same percentages, but it was, again, just the absolute number was a lot less than what I really wanted. But, it was a start anyway. But sadly, again, I think as everybody knows, that beginning in the summer of 21, that Delta did hit the US and absolutely took off. And remember, during that time, still less than, I think, 40% of the US population had been vaccinated. So Delta was, particularly devastating, particularly to older people and immunocompromised folks, and really drove the mortality numbers. And then, of course, in the late fall, through the winter, the Omicron variant hit. So we really were in trouble. This came out actually in the New York Times and Washington Post, both about probably in late July, around the time that Delta was really hitting us in the US. And Abbott Laboratories at that time had about 90% of the market share in the manufacturing capacity for both point of care and over-the-counter tests. Their Binax Now test, very good test, was really the major one that we were procuring at that point. Since again, we wanted to support American manufacturing, and we had the capacity to do it. So Abbott had 5 diagnostic manufacturing plants. And when I'm sure it was probably the same day that in May, when I had this kind of discouraging call with the White House when they cut my CTS budget significantly, I'm sure, again, my CDC industry representative probably got on the phone with Abbott, which was his job, and gave them a heads up that, hey, sorry, you're not going to be getting that big order that we had talked about. And so it came out a few weeks later that Abbott actually shut down 2 of their 5 manufacturing plants, laid off 1,500 employees, and destroyed inventory. And again, this came out later in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And of course, at that time, Delta was off to the races, and we were really struggling with a shortage of diagnostic tests. So anyway, the White House did, though, support me when I went back to them with additional money requests. So I was given an extra $745 million to basically extend ICAT through the spring of 22. Again, in addition to the $889 million for what we call at this point CTS1, I was given another $1.95 billion also for point of care and over-the-counter tests, which we called CTS2, and an additional $1.1 billion, which we called CTS3. Largely, similar in distribution to what we were requesting for these vulnerable populations. Also was given approval for another $126 million for TDWG operations to continue, and Operation ET support. So basically coordinate the data management from these 3 different hubs. And then was also given an additional $2.3 billion for additional purchases of not only completed tests, but actually swabs, media, and other supplies that were needed to actually produce finished tests. Was also given several $100 million to create a biorepository that would be available to industry as well as federal partners to actually develop new assays. And then was given some money to send back to BARDA and to RADx, as well as to purchase some multiplex assays as well to look for things like flu and RSV, as well as COVID-19. Let's see here. Okay, so again, I won't go through all the names, obviously, but this was just a list of some of the 82 people that I was so privileged to work with during that job. Just shifting gears a little bit, that I think some of you know, that you've heard funny stories that I've known Dr. Fauci since 1978, and sometime you can ask me, I can tell you a bunch of funny stories. So one of the things that I enjoyed about being back in DC was, getting to see him several times, including informally. And actually, Julie took this picture of Tony and me with Cliff Lane, who is actually the head of clinical research for the NIH. And Cliff has actually worked with Tony since the late 1970s. And yeah, we laughed about, a lot of funny stories from the old days. This was actually Julie's big night, and this was at the National Academy of Medicine. Julie had been inducted in 2019, but the ceremony wasn't held until 2021. And again, Tony, of course, has been a member of the National Academy. And so he's posing with Julie, who's again being honored that night as a new inductee into the National Academy. The person, to my right is Dr. Henry Masur, along with some other colleagues from the NIH. And Henry and I were the troublemakers that started the Infectious Disease Society of America sepsis task force back in about 2016, when we were concerned about some of the recommendations that were coming out of the Surviving Sepsis campaign. So again, it was fun, seeing Henry and his colleagues. So we got together several times. And this is my CDC boss, Dr. Rochelle Walensky. And when I met with her for the first time back in April after I arrived in DC, she kind of gave me a heads up that at some point the TDWG would be going away, and wanted to know if I'd be willing to stay on to help out with some other issues. And of course, I said yes. And sadly, it didn't take that long. So I think all of you remember that in August, early August of 2021, we basically shut down our big base at Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan and pulled our last special operations troops out of Afghanistan that we had there to support the Afghan National Army. And within weeks, like literally within 3 weeks, Mazar-i-Sharif fell, Kandahar fell, Herat fell to the Taliban, and then finally Kabul fell. And all of the people that had worked with us and, had been our friends, of course, they're fearing for their lives because they're all under death threats now by the Taliban. So these were some of the scenes that, we would see on the news. Just going back, obviously, to 9/11, I'd been serving in the military since 1980. And I think all of you who are old enough to remember that terrible day on 9/11, 2001, when basically the terrorists, who had been trained in Afghanistan, struck the World Trade Center with 2 airliners. A third airliner hit the west side of the Pentagon, and a fourth airliner was actually crashed deliberately by the brave passengers out near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So this really was a terrible, terrible day. And of course, President Bush, I think, made the right decision, basically to invade Afghanistan, to remove this terrible, safe haven, where the terrorists trained that killed 3,000 people on that day. I think all of us that served in both Afghanistan and Iraq believe we were not only avenging that day, but also we were trying to create democracy and take care of the people in both of those countries that had suffered so terribly, under, both Saddam Hussein's regime and, of course, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And just to show you, I'm sorry, a little graphic picture, but again, women's rights was something that basically was just suffered so terribly, particularly under Taliban rule. The women were not allowed to go to school, were not allowed in most professions, and were required to wear burqas and headscarves and things like that. And I think all of us that were, that served in particularly Afghanistan, believed that we were doing really something good to help remake this country into a democratic regime where all humans would have rights. And by the way, this kind of graphic picture is what women's rights looks like under the Taliban or under ISIS. This is actually a young mother that my burn surgeons saved her life, who basically had gasoline poured on her by her husband. She was the mother of a 2-year-old toddler. So again, our surgeons saved her life, and I was eventually able to get her sent to Shriners Burn Center in Boston, where she underwent skin grafting. And as far as I know, she's hopefully still alive. So again, these are just some scenes from Afghanistan, and upper left is Bagram Airfield looking toward the south, and upper right picture is again my crew members during one of the combat missions I flew. These are Afghan National Army soldiers who wanted their picture taken with us. Lower left is President Hamid Karzai. I was his doctor for several days while he went out and gave speeches in 2004. And as I mentioned, we took care of a lot of non-combatants, and particularly children since we did have the enough excess medical capacity, we could do it. And this is something we took a lot of pride in. But also remember, when we abandoned Afghanistan, we didn't just abandon our Afghan friends and people that supported us. We also abandoned our almost 10,000 coalition partners who were there. So when we pulled chocks in the middle of the night and left the country, we also left all of these other countries that were supporting our efforts in Afghanistan as well. So, again, these are just some scenes from both Iraq and Afghanistan, and why I think all of us veterans who served there were just so heartbroken to see the chaos and the tragedy unfold as it did in August of 21. So again, sadly, we didn't save everybody that we tried to, and I think all of us put literally our hearts and souls into what we did. And Julie has heard me say this, and some of you have as well, that I can't even listen to the 23rd Psalm because it brings up these memories of all of the Patriot details, which is what we called when our American casualties would be loaded onto a C-130 or a C-17 to be flown back to Dover Air Force Base. I was also deployed to Afghanistan in 2011 on May 2nd, when the SEAL team left Afghanistan and flew to Abbottabad, Pakistan, to kill Osama bin Laden. My crew and I were actually on alert that night on May 2nd. And so, when we learned the next day what had happened, I think all of us honestly felt we had won the war, and that things finally had turned around in Afghanistan. So I remember after working all day in the medicine clinic, I'd volunteered to fly another combat mission that night of May 3rd, and a shower had just crossed the field, and I was looking toward the east across the flight line at Bagram. I saw this rainbow, and I almost started crying, thinking that actually it was a sign from God that we had done the right thing. So anyway, we actually, about a month later, it was our turn to rotate home, and we actually even took our flight suits off and flew our C-130s wearing blue jeans, which of course is against the rule. But I remember when one of the young enlisted folks asked me, quietly, like, "Colonel, can't we get in trouble if the Air Force finds out we're flying the C-130s in blue jeans?" And I immediately said, "Well, what are they going to do, airmen? Make us get short haircuts and send us to Afghanistan?" So anyway, fast forward to the end of August. So 124,000 Afghan refugees ended up arriving in the US over a period of just a couple of weeks. So it really was a big effort to support their health needs. So this is actually a scene of a C-17 flying out of Kabul International that they loaded 937 Afghans in. Just absolutely amazing. So it was a real honor, for me personally and for other members of my team that had served in the military, to basically be on the ground at Dulles International Airport when the very first flight of Afghans arrived. And I took this photograph. Again, I forget the exact day, but we had our ICAT testing team there, along with Virginia Department of Public Health, doing health screening, as well as providing COVID-19 immunizations. And as I said, point of care testing, as they got off the plane. So again, if necessary, they could be quarantined or isolated to protect each other. The Afghan refugees were initially put up at 8 different military bases around the US. And as the senior CDC advisor, I worked closely with them and had a conference call at least once a week with each of the bases and their public health people to talk about issues. So some of the diseases that we saw included measles. Because the incubation period is short, so most of the measles cases that we saw in Afghan refugees were actually when they were still in the lily pads, either in Oman or Qatar, where they would spend up to a week or so before coming to the US. And then another disease, which we saw a number of cases of, which really didn't surprise me at all, was tuberculosis. Again, Afghanistan has a very high rate of tuberculosis. And I first became aware of this when I was deployed there in 2011. And even though I wasn't there as an infectious disease specialist, I was asked by the US Army, who actually was responsible for the healthcare of the detainees at the detention facility in Parwan, which was on the northeast side of our airfield at Bagram, to help them with screening and treatment procedures for tuberculosis. So again, we work very closely with our public health partners and TB controllers, basically to screen and treat both latent TB as well as active TB, in these Afghan refugees at the 8 safe haven bases. We also, again, these are just some photographs of 2011 with the Afghan detainees. We also saw some kind of interesting tropical diseases, and this is cutaneous leishmaniasis. And we were very fortunate to have good support from academic medical centers that were close by these 8 different bases. University of Minnesota was just great. And of course, Walter Reed, which has tremendous expertise in leishmaniasis, was a great resource as well for a lot of these unusual diseases. So one of the things, again, in February of 22, when most of the, I think at that point, all but about 20,000 of the Afghan refugees had been resettled, and I think 6 of the 8 safe haven bases had been closed. But they anticipated that Afghan refugees would continue to arrive, not 124,000 at a time, but by perhaps as many as 2 or 3 plane loads a week. Would be coming to the US still. And again, each plane usually contained about 300 individuals, depending on the size of the aircraft. So they wanted to open a facility near Washington Dulles that could, handle these individuals for up to a couple of weeks until they could be resettled with family or with other sponsoring agencies in the US. So again, this is the National Convention Center in Leesburg, Virginia, which is about 12 miles or so north of Dulles Airport, which is west of Washington, D.C. Big facility, had been largely vacant since COVID-19, and it was just an ideal location. And of course, Department of Homeland Security was a lead agency for the Afghan resettlement effort. And they actually had a town meeting, and Bob Fenton, who was the head of this effort for DHS, wanted me to be there to represent the CDC. So I just thought this was going to be, kind of an interesting educational meeting. The mayor of Leesburg was speaking, and I just couldn't imagine that people would not be welcoming these refugees with open arms, for all the reasons that I mentioned. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted that speaker after speaker got up to the microphone and had all of these dark, horrible theories that these are terrorists that they're bringing into the country, and they've not been vetted, and they're rapists and murderers, and our children will be put at risk. And I just got so upset, hearing this one person after another. And it's, again, this all, this right wing, internet kind of stuff. And I actually raised my hand and I asked the mayor, I said, can I speak? And she said, of course, Dr. Winslow. So I got up to the podium, and I literally took my HHS badge off and slammed it on the podium. And I had tears in my eyes, and I said, hey, I'm not speaking as a CDC employee. I'm speaking as a veteran of Afghanistan. And these people are good people, and they put their lives at risk to support us. And, we owe them this safety, as Americans. And a few people in the audience actually got up and clapped. But again, it was, very upsetting. So, again, this is a movie actually I haven't seen yet that came out just a few weeks ago, but it talks about the close relationships that many of us had with our interpreters, translators, and medical liaisons, and people that we worked with downrange. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing this movie, although I'm sure it'll bring back bad memories. This young man in the short sleeves in the middle of his photograph is, his name is Courage, and Courage is an Afghan translator. Young man, I think this picture was probably taken in 2010. In 2011, he was terribly wounded by an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan while he was supporting this U.S. infantry division. And even though I didn't meet him at the time, he was actually being cared for. He spent 4 months in the hospital. He had like 8 surgeries at Bagram Airfield. But I did run into him when we were living at Stanford in Washington. And this is Q, as he likes to be called, who was one of the security guards at Stanford in Washington on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, which is Stanford's sort of small campus we have. And just an absolutely lovely man. he would tease me every morning when I'd go out to run. And but anyway, so this was what we were fighting for, and we felt that we needed to support these people who put their lives at risk to help our mission in Afghanistan. One of the actually only other people at this Leesburg, Virginia meeting that got up to speak in favor of the Afghan resettlement was a woman, a Methodist minister. And she actually read this passage, which is from Matthew 25, about come, you who are blessed, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. So this is what we're supposed to do with refugees. Last thing I want to talk about is the other refugee crisis, and these are unaccompanied children fleeing, through Mexico, across the Rio Grande River, to try to get to a better life in the U.S. And remember, these unaccompanied children were actually very much loved by their parents, and they're fleeing terrible conditions in Central America mostly. And for a mother or father to entrust their child to a coyote, which is what they call them, to be smuggled to the U.S., just tells you how desperate they are and how much they love their children. So being the chief medical officer for the children at the southwest border was something that really meant a lot to me as well. And so this is a little bit of data for where the unaccompanied children come from. About 47% from Guatemala, next largest number from Honduras, 13% from El Salvador, and really a small number from Mexico and other Central American countries. So one of the things I think many of you remember, particularly that was given voice during the Trump administration, was this whole idea of the great replacement theory, that people with brown skins and people that speak in Spanish are going to take over our country. And I personally just found this just absolutely reprehensible. And so that was one thing that I really liked about the Biden administration, was that at least, people aren't talking about deliberate cruelty to immigrants anymore. And of course, this guy, Tucker Carlson, was a big proponent of the great replacement theory. And then again, these are the Tiki Torch people that marched in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, saying, Jews will not replace us. Black people will not replace us. Hispanics will not replace us. So just really absolutely reprehensible stuff that was given voice during the Trump administration. And these are, again, forget what they were called, Patriot Front. And it's been pointed out that, they're wearing unmatched pants. And then this, of course, was the first lady during the Trump administration. This is Melania Trump. And when she visited the unaccompanied children at the southwest border, this is the coat that she wore. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "I really don't care, do you?" So this was just terrible. This is Pat Robertson, who just died last week. And again, he was a big proponent of Christian nationalism. So I didn't really understand, during the Trump administration, just why this idea got so much traction and why Christians supported him so much. But fortunately, a lot of people don't. And this was a church I walked by every day, which interestingly espouses what used to be Republican values, that all people are welcome. So the Republicans used to be the party of civil rights. They were the party of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s. They were the party, Richard Nixon quadrupled the funding of the NIH, and he also created the Environmental Protection Agency. George W. Bush wanted comprehensive immigration reform. But anyway, so long time. So I'll close real quickly, but I think everybody knows I'm not the smartest doctor at Stanford. So this is, I think, is the reason. This is 1969 Dover High School varsity football team. And the handsome guy next to the coach wearing number 37, that's me. So I got like way too many hits on the head. But I tried to do the best I could, with the brains I had left. And this is another guy that I really like a lot, which my children think I am Forrest Gump. So this is the shortened version of Matthew 25. I was a refugee and you welcomed me. So we did do a good job, and we actually did testing at 5 of the 9 Customs and Border Protection sector stations that had 90% of the unaccompanied children. My big concern was I didn't want to put COVID-19 infected kids on the same bus with uninfected kids and have even more outbreaks. And so we basically did rapid testing, at these CBP sector stations, and then the kids were put on either a hot bus or a cold bus for sometimes a several-hour ride to one of the HHS EIS shelters. One kind of other just really funny thing is that the CBP folks, they're law enforcement, so it's a very masculine culture. They really do care, though, about the children. And I just, want people to know, though, is they're not bad people, but it's a little different culture than certainly we have at the CDC or we have, as doctors at Stanford in California. So there was one meeting kind of early in my tenure as when I was still on active duty. And there was one kind of new CBP commander who was being really disrespectful to Ellen Kirsch on the call. And I remember really getting annoyed at him. And so I usually had my camera off, but I turned my camera on and I was wearing my uniform. And I said in a very stern voice, "Officer, listen up. Let me tell you how we did this downrange." And all of a sudden, this CBP officer, he's like, comes to attention. He said, "Yes, Colonel, roger that, sir." So anyway, I did spend quite a bit of time one week at the Fort Bliss, which is one of the large EIS shelters, and again, the children were generally resettled within 7 or 8 days, from the time they actually got to an EIS shelter. So very proud of the great work that our HHS colleagues did while we were there. And again, I'm going to close. I'm sorry, kind of ran a little bit over time, but again, it was a wonderful experience, and I'm just very grateful to all of the people that I worked with. So I'll stop there.
Dr. Winslow, thank you so much for that. I like to joke, whenever I hear you talk about any experiences, I feel like I'm watching a movie because of the things that you've done and been through. It's like iconic from when you down your badge. I remember that moment, traveling to Antarctica with Dr. Parsonet, going all over the world, all the amazing stuff you do. We are hitting the end of time. I just want to highlight a number of comments. Dr. Kim, you said, "I hope this recording becomes part of required curriculum for med students and residents, at least in medicine, because it encompasses so many important areas. Thank you, Dean and his teams." I mean, a number of comments coming through. Stunning talk, true hero, patriot. Thank you for what you've done. Thank you, Dr. Winslow, for a reminder about the value of human compassion. I'll tell you, since over 10 plus years I've known you, you've been an absolute model for me. And I found myself oftentimes in tough, challenging situations, asking what Dean would do. So Dean, thank you so much for the amazing work you do. We are out of time, so if you have any questions, please do reach out to Dean. He has some amazing stories, and I have a number of questions for you. I'm going to have to reach out to you later. It must have been super frustrating when they destroyed all those Binax tests, especially when Dr. Parson gave the original grand rounds on the projection of COVID and how it would stick along here forever, and she was completely accurate. So it must have been super challenging at times. But Dean, thank you so much for being who you are. And with that, I will close it out. I hope everybody has a great day. And thank you for sticking around.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.